The Lord gave me a message for this new year. I believe 2014 will be the year of double grace. Can you all say double grace for me? Now, there's two ways to take that. One way is I'm not going to have any problems whatsoever. God's grace is going to cause me not to go through trial. That may happen. But you might need double grace because you're going to have double trouble. You're going to need that grace to overcome every situation. But I know God's grace is sufficient, as Paul penned in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It is all we need in life, is this marvelous grace. So I'm calling this new series, Amazing Grace. Yeah, I just made it up. No, because after we get through this month of January, learning about grace, we are going to literally say, it's amazing. This grace is amazing. It is more than I've ever imagined it to be. This is fantastic. I never saw grace in this kind of light. So get ready for the month of January as we grow in God's grace. And our foundation text is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10. Paul wrote, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me." Paul was the greatest post-resurrection apostle that God ever called, and to this day is still the greatest post-resurrection apostle. In fact, Paul himself admitted that he had actually preached and won more people than all the 12 apostles together. He had done incredible mission work that to this day boggles the mind. And in our Bible, the writings of the apostle Paul are more than all the writings of the apostles, the original 12, put together. And yet, there was a revelation that Paul had that very few of the apostles had in this extent. He had a revelation of grace. In fact, the apostle Paul called his gospel in another place the gospel of grace. In some places, he called it the gospel of Christ, but in other places, the gospel of grace. So that means if I'm to understand the gospel, I should definitely understand who Christ is, but I must understand what grace is as well. So I must know the who of the gospel, Christ, and the what of the gospel, and that's grace. So we're going to unveil the message of grace in a way that for some of you, it's going to seem amazing to you. You're going to look and think, I never thought about that before. I can't believe this great grace that's been given to me. What am I doing with it? And that's the key. Paul did something with the grace that God gave him. In fact, he did something that he could declare, I am what I am. Can you proudly say, I am what I am, and be proud to say it? But when Paul said it, there was no pride, because he said, by the grace of God, I am what I am. He understood it was the grace of God that made him from a sinner to a saint. He was once a persecutor of the church, but now he's a promoter of the church. At one time he was mean and angry, but now he's kind and loving. Before he was impatient and judging, but now he's patient and compassionate. What transformed him? Paul said it was the grace of God that did the transforming work, and I am what I am because of that. Kind of reminds me of Popeye the Sailor Man. Y'all remember? Popeye the Sailor Man, Popeye the Sailor Man. I am what I am, that's all what I am, Popeye the Sailor Man. Now, but I want you to remember, because I am what I am. Every good thing that I am today, I owe it to the grace of God, not to myself. So even when Paul says, I worked harder than everybody, he stopped for a moment, swallowed a dose of humility, and said, but not I. but the grace of God that was with me. So even his good deeds, he credited to grace. Even the good character he become, he credited to grace. Never once was there boasting. So when you come to comprehend the grace of God, pride has to vanish. And when you look at someone who's struggling in sin and they're going through difficulties, never can you judge them and say, if they were only like me. What do you mean? I'm only like me because of the grace that made me like me. So I can't judge others because this grace teaches me that every good thing that I am and every good deed I've done and every good blessing I've received, it wasn't what I did. It was the grace of God that was with me. Now, this grace is fantastic. It is amazing. But I do have a concern for the modern church because there are those who are preaching what I like to call, for lack of a better term, the modern grace message. And I call it the modern grace message because it's not really the full biblical grace message. It's not the historic grace message that our church fathers had been preaching for 2,000 years. It's something new. And basically, I like to look at this modern grace message more as a limited grace, where they don't see the fullness of this grace. They don't understand what Peter said about grace. In 1 Peter 4:10, he called this grace the multifaceted grace. Can y'all say multifaceted? This grace, you never can see it all. There's too much to this grace. You look at grace from this perspective and you see what it can make you become. You look at it from another perspective, you see what you can have. You look at it from another perspective, you see the empowerment of what you can do. Every time you look at grace, it's always going to be multifaceted.